Alright, class. Who is this guy? Calm down. You right there with the face.
Stan Lee, of course. He's the creator of Marvel.
Good job. Alright, one more. Who is this guy?
Joe Pesci?
No.
Albert Einstein?
No?
One of the leaders of the 5 families in New York City?
Why do you know about them? Class, this is the late Jack Kirby, the king of comics. Let's investigate Stan Lee's celebrity status and the erasure of Jack Kirby. It's the 1940s. War is waging in the East, and I'm bored. So what do? Oh, what's that? Let's take a few steps back real quick. Funny enough, as much credit Stan Lee receives for the success of Marvel, it doesn't even start with him. Jack Kirby, or at the time, Jacob Kurtzberg, embarked upon this comic book empire creation while working under Victor Fox. While at Fox's studio, he was introduced to a fellow artist, Joe Simon. These two were working back and forth for a couple of comic book studios at the time. As Simon made his way up the ranks at Timely, he brought Kirby on as his art director. By now, a few characters like Bucky, Namor, and Human Torch had existed, but the character that Kirby created and was deeply satisfied about was Captain America, the same old Cap that was kicking Hitler and Red Skull's ass. As the Captain America comics began to pick up, Martin Goodman, CEO of Timely Comics, introduced his nephew to the team, Stanley Lieber, or as the public knows him today, Stan Lee. Depending on the perspective, Stan Lee was either seen as a helper around the office or a nuisance. Some time passed and eventually Stan Lee became an editor for the company. Before anything really took off, Kirby was drafted and Lee later joined to help the war effort. Both were tasked with different objectives while serving. Kirby having frontline experience while Lee helped create comics to help troops with financial programs. Now pause. Right here is when we can acknowledge the dynamics the pairs already began to separate the two. Jack Kirby the artist, and Stan Lee the editor. In a hierarchical sense, the credit almost always goes to the brand, publisher, or the editor before the artist even receives any kind of recognition. Furthermore, once Kirby returned from the war, he had to deal with the comic killer. Jokes aside, 1954, publishing companies were going out of business and comics were under attack. Dr. Frederick, comics killer, Wertham, released his text Seduction of the Innocent, convinced the audience the harmful effects of comics, stating comic books are an invitation to illiteracy. This conjecture led to mass boycotts from the public. Ultimately, the government intervened and compromised with the publishers, creating the Comics Code Authority. This organization implemented a set of rules that have to be followed by the studios. Here's a few. Authority figures like police, judges, and government officials must always be shown with respect. Good must always win, and criminals must be punished. Comics are not allowed to use the words horror or terror in their titles. Comics cannot include zombies, torture, vampires, ghouls, cannibalism, or werewolves. Swearing, sexual content, and other offensive language or symbols are not allowed. Characters must dress in ways society considers appropriate. And lastly, comics must promote respect for parents, morality, and honorable behavior and cannot portray love in disturbing ways. Artists are significantly impacted by this change because now their creativity is limited. The backlash was so impactful it resulted in Kirby being dropped from his studio. Meanwhile, Lee still maintained his position as an editor. This foreshadows several times in which Kirby will get casted into the shadows based on his circumstances, and Lee maintains his agency. Kirby made the decision to work at National, or as we know it now, DC Comics. Due to legal issues, this stint didn't last all that long, and Kirby eventually reunited with Lee at the decline of Marvel. Together, they made history. Romance comics, Western comics, sci-fi comics, monster comics, heroes, villains, comics. They were unstoppable until tensions rose again. You see, Kirby was only getting credited for the layout of these comics. Kirby had felt discredited for all the work he was putting into the company. Conversations were had, and the credit shifted from Kirby only being responsible for the layout to a Stan Lee and Jack Kirby production. Despite this change, Lee was reluctant to hear the ideas that Kirby advocated for story-wise. Obviously frustrated, Kirby channeled this into his last issue of Fantastic Four before leaving. Once again, we get insight on this toxic dynamic between the two. Everything that is said and done goes through Lee, the editor. even to a point where Lee wanted to create the characters while Kirby just illustrated them. What would be the best maneuver for Kirby to take? Go to the rival company. Carmine Infantino, DC Comics editor and artist, was in full support of Kirby's arrival. Kirby, now at the helm of his own projects and having full control, did successfully create iconic characters. Orion, Mr. Miracle, Darkseid, just to name a few. Kirby relishing in this freedom was met with another experience of his credit being discounted. Stan Lee decided to set everything in stone when he released Origins of Marvel Comics by Stan Lee. Much to Kirby's disappointment, he was only accredited as an illustrator of Lee's ideas. Let's recap two aspects that has hurt Kirby's ties and exposure to the Marvel brand. The first one is the separation, and the second is the discounting of his work, further bolstering Stan Lee into the stratosphere. Another complimentary aspect Stan would do to subconsciously influence the fandom was the Stan soapbox. Before the age of the internet, Lee would reach out to the audience via text blocks in the comics, ranging from questions, updates, and future plans. Outside of Lee's name already being on the cover, now exists an actual perception of who's behind the art. Back to Kirby at DC Comics, he definitely experienced his ups and downs, but eventually didn't renew his contract there. It's Comic-Con 1974. Kirby decides to make his big return. Kirby runs into Roy Thomas, a comic book editor edition after Kirby's departure. Woods claimed that due to Kirby's harmful statements and depictions of the Marvel staff that it would be difficult for him to rejoin. None of that shit was true. Lee accepted Kirby with open arms. This era of Kirby and Lee was the most redeemable. Several projects were made to help celebrate Kirby, giving him credit for the many staples he created while at Marvel. The duo went full throttle and continued to put out impressive work. Even with this newfound appreciation for Kirby, what happens next finalizes their dynamic. July 14, 2000 marks the date of the first X-Men film. Here begins the long-running gag of Stan Lee showing up in Marvel films. At this point, Jack Kirby had nearly been deceased for 6 years. These consistent cameos were the biggest part in mainstreaming Stan Lee as an individual. Lee was featured in just about every Marvel film release going forward. Kirby has 2 cameos when it comes to being featured in live action. Once in the 1979 Incredible Hulk, and the other in the 2025 Fantastic Four First Steps film. Lee himself appears on the screen 38 times. This is the final separation between the two. Although Kirby was shielded from glory due to being an artist, and he was granted less recognition for his addition to the work that he put out, his death in 1994 occurred before superheroes became the staple in the box office. The acquisition of Marvel by Disney didn't happen until 2009, so now Stan Lee becomes the face, the voice, the cameo. Credit doesn't just come from creation, but rather visibility, control, and from who gets to tell the story. This isn't about taking credit away from Stan Lee. It's about giving it back to Jack Kirby. Thanks for watching.